Hi everyone, Mark here, and today we're going to do a bit of an experiment. We will do our first reading of an article that comes from the blog, more specifically, an article series. For those who have been following the channel long enough, if you remember, at the beginning of the year, I released a video discussing what was upcoming for 2022, and one of the things that I mentioned in that video is that I was interested in and was considering to do readings of articles that came from the blog, given that the blog is where I put the most polished work, let's say. Generally, this is where I'm gonna, put the output product of a lot of research that I do. And so I do take a lot of time and care to make sure that it's well crafted, that it's well written, whereas, when we're talking about the vlog that you're watching right now, generally I do those a little bit more on a whim. I do them a little bit more freeform. I do write some notes, but I don't write anything as thorough as what goes to the blog. As for the stuff that goes on Instagram, these are generally just highlights and notes. It's relatively short, and just the pictures themselves are relatively quick to take. So this is going to be a first. I hope you're going to enjoy. But at any rate, please make sure to leave comments in the comment section down below. Today's reading will be not one article, but actually a collection of 6 articles. It is the series of articles that was released earlier this week regarding Horikawa, Kodo, and the title of Eisei Meijin. Again, I hope you enjoy, and without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so here we have the Eisei Meijin title, the certificate, I'm sorry. Before I go further, I need to, basically mention to the readers that I'm not part of the Kodokai, the lineage that Horikawa Kodo ended up creating, right? For those who are not familiar with daito-ryu, daito-ryu is a very sparse tradition in the sense that from one person who popularized it, Takeda Sokaku, many of his students and pupils ended up basically creating their own lineages. And the Kodokai is one, Horikawa Kodo having been a direct student of Takeda Sokaku sensei. So that's actually the reason why I have an interest in his profile and character and history. I'm interested in all the students that have studied under and practiced under Sokaku Sensei, because given that he is probably the one focal point through that to which all the lineage and all the matters concerning daito-ryu basically always end up going back to, learning anything about students and their character, their history, and through which part of their life they ended up meeting with Takeda Sokaku Sensei, I think is informative of how we can think of him and to some degree to his legacy and the practice that he left us with, essentially. So while I'm not a student of that particular lineage, I think it is that the history of its founder is of great interest to all, and that's the reason why I basically, researched him. I researched his father, as I mentioned at the beginning of the cover article. I pulled out a quote from a newspaper in Hokkaido in 2019. That basically discussed a little bit the background of Horikawa Kodo's father, Horikawa Taiso, who was initially from Iwate Prefecture, and like many Japanese people from that era, basically decided to try his luck and go to Hokkaido. At the time, Hokkaido was basically just settlements, basically. I think the government was sponsoring some of it in the format of, if you can keep the land for a certain amount of time, then the land is yours and you don't have to pay for it. In Horikawa Taiso's particular case, he was very lucky, basically. He went to do gold prospecting and ended up basically striking gold, and from there built up quite a fortune. He was himself a student of Takeda Sokaku Sensei, one of the earlier one. Now, when we're talking about early student, we need to keep in mind that the earliest students known were all in the 1900s. However, many of those students, we don't know all that much about them. Most of the students that we know some things about, or that are, say well known, are generally students that come from the 1910, 1912 and onward. And that's true of Horikawa Taiso, it's true of Horikawa Kodo as well. Horikawa Taiso, I think, met Takeda Sokaku Sensei in 1912. He's also noteworthy due to the fact that it is at one of his inns/hotels where Takeda Sokaku met Ueshiba Mohie, who ended up becoming the founder of Aikido. So for those who are interested in what's the relation between Aikido and daito-ryu, that's essentially where it started, and Horikawa Taiso essentially played a role in that. Now, Horikawa Kodo himself was throughout his life an educator and a school director, so he was very well known for that, but he was also very well known for his martial arts practice. One of the things that I don't mention in the article is that, or I sort of brush over it at a certain time when speaking of his relationship to Ishida Kazuto, is that he was also a Kendo practitioner, like many people of the time, holding a third dan in Kendo, if I'm not mistaken. So he was very well known as being quite fierce, apparently, and that's according to Ishida Kazuto's recollection, I believe. Now, with that said, he is clearly much more remembered for his connection to daito-ryu and his students, and many of the students of the offshoots of the Kodokai basically would argue that he was most well known for his Aiki skills. Now, we're not going to enter into that discussion for the purpose of this reading, but suffice to say that even if that would have been the case, he was still relatively well known for his work as well as his Budo practice overall, right? Now, the reason why I ended up basically stumbling on that certificate is a little bit interesting. I got contacted by a fellow, let's say, amateur researcher, and he was asking a question about Horikawa Taiso, and those kind of questions are always interesting to me because they tend to highlight where my blind spots are in terms of research and the areas I'm going to need to cover eventually. With that said, everyone's when I get those kinds of requests for information or those questions, what I try to do is I try to do some light research in the documents that I have in my private archives. And just try to figure out if I can, quickly come up with an answer, right? It's kind of give and take. When you're working with other people who are also doing research, anytime you can help them, it's kind of, maybe they're going to be able to help you back, right? So in this particular case, that's how I run into the certificate that you're seeing on screen right now. And the reason why that certificate caught my attention is because it's quite special. It's quite particular in nature. Generally, you would expect a certificate to have some logo, some organizational designation, but here all you have is essentially the name of the recipient, the name of a title, or we're going to get into that a little bit later, or maybe it's an award or whatnot that's being presented, and then you get a list of 8 people are signing on it, right? So a lot of this stuff is really, really unique, and that's what caught my attention. So initially, I wanted to write just a quick article on that. I figured, there's 8 people. Finding information about them is going to be probably the extent to which I'm going to be able to figure that stuff out. But the other thing also that's worth mentioning is that, again, I had heard the term, the title Meijin being used, but I didn't really know what it meant. I knew what the word means, but as a title, I didn't know, like, was that supposed to line up with a title from another organization? Is there a traditional use of the term as a title that I'm not aware of? And why is it prefixed with Eisei, right? Meaning eternal or permanent. So again, just looking at the certificate itself, there was so many questions that came to mind that I figured out, hey, I'm gonna try to dig into that a little bit more tonight. One night became a couple of days, which became a week, then became a month, and then it became 2 months, as I was also basically writing various drafts for this article, and eventually it became an article series. So that was pretty lengthy, and that's what led me to basically decide, upon the suggestion of a university student that I speak to every once in a while. So you know who you are. Thank you for the recommendation. That was a really good idea. I essentially ended up just breaking the content down into initially it was a 4-part series. The 5th part came a little bit at the last minute because I just stumbled upon a whole bunch of material related to the circumstances and event of the awarding the certificate that I hadn't initially come across. And I decided, well, I already have a 4-part series that kind of goes through the process that I followed to gather some understanding of the document. So might as well just slap the actual tangible information, concrete information that I found into a 5th part. And I thought it was really a good opportunity to kind of show how the sausage is made, essentially, right? Or at least how I make the sausage. Everyone, a lot of the time when you're going to see an article that I'm going to be releasing, that's going to be like 20% of what I could have written about it. And not only that, but a lot of the actual minutia, the little details about the topic are kind of going to be missing, and that's going to be kept in my note. And generally I try to go in that direction simply because I want to make sure not to overwhelm people, right? Now here, instead, what I decided to do is to say, listen, I'll write a cover article that summarizes each point. People will be able to dig into whatever part is of interest to them, or they're going to be able to read the whole piece as a whole. But to have some ideas and to promote the idea that, like, hey, this is one way you can do research, and if you're interested and you have questions about the tradition, you can do that research as well. Interestingly enough, for the purpose of this series, I got a good deal of help, or at least I was able to discuss with people from various organizations, some people from the Kodo, some people from its offshoots, and that was a guiding force in my research. But all the information I list here is essentially, it's open source. It's either physical magazines or actually I think 80% of what we have here is essentially either found online, or you can find some indexed version of it online. So there's certain books you're not going to be able to find in digitized format, but which Google Books is going to have indexed, and you're going to be able to basically find some quotes. So you're going to be able to know what books to actually go hunt after. So let's just basically go over each part. I'm not going to go too deep in each one of them because that's going to be taking that would take a long time. But just to give the viewer an idea of what we're talking about and try to contextualize what the content is. All right, so part 1, document analysis. So starting with the document and not doing any additional research. I wanted to know, like, what am I looking at essentially, right? And why might it be structured in such a way, right? So I just spent a lot of time just looking at it and noting everything that came to mind, essentially, right? So the first thing that you see on the document, if you go back, is basically that part here, right? So the name of Horikawa Kodo and some titles that you can see here. The title that's used is essentially Daito-ryu Aiki Jujutsu Menkyo Kaiden. That's a bit unusual in the sense that generally Menkyo Kaiden is not a title, it's a license. It's like I'm not sure I can think of an example, but if you're a certified swimming instructor, you don't really use this as a title, right? I guess. And generally you're not going to see this on public-facing documents unless they're basically related to the daito-ryu certification process. So basically, if it's related to a daito-ryu certificate, you might see the term Menkyo Kaiden written next to the person's name. But generally, that's going to be the person that's awarding a document that's going to say, "I'm a Menkyo Kaiden in daito-ryu." And they're generally going to put that on the certificate or document that they're awarding to somebody else, so that the credentials of the certifier basically are established. And that's what you can see here basically in the I think the case at the bottom. This one has Shihan Menkyo Shihan here. And this one, Aiki Jujutsu Hombucho. So you can see here that they're not using Menkyo Kaiden in this particular case. Sorry, yes, they're using it. Here it's Menkyo Kaiden, basically. Right at next to Horikawa Sensei's name on the right. So, that bottom document is essentially something that is a certification document. The one at the top is basically a Kyoju Dairi license. And that's par for the course, basically. I've seen documents like that structured a similar way, where the individual giving a densho or transmission document would basically put the term Menkyo Kaiden in there. It's not always done like that. Some do, some don't, but generally, again, the person who's going to be awarding a document would be the person that would normally say, "Oh, I'm a Menkyo Kaiden in daito-ryu," basically. So it wouldn't be a title that you would be referred by somebody else generally. For that's why, like you see here in the top document, you see Hombucho, Horikawa, Kodo, right? Because Hombucho, Sonbucho, those are titles that you can find in daito-ryu that are actual titles. Like Kyoju Dairi is kind of in between. It is a license, but you could arguably say it is also kind of a title because of the way it relates to the person you're representing. Which is the head instructor, basically. That's the mentality that was following the document. Now, moving to the proclamation, so the actual core of the document that's saying something. It says Eisei Meijin no shogo o okurimasu. So awarded the title / rank of Eternal Master. Now, one of the kanji that's being used is an older version of it, so when you're dealing with historical document or with, like in this particular case, with documents that are written in a more traditional context, often people are going to elect to use the older version of certain characters, mostly for stylistic reason, I think. Sometimes there's a historical reason for that, but generally it's not all that important. What is interesting here is the basically shogo, that would translate into title, and the I that would translate to rank, essentially, right? I don't know if that's going to show, but here basically these are the characters I'm talking about, right? So the way it's phrased is a little bit hard to translate. It's basically like the rank. We're presenting the title of Eisei Meijin rank would be kind of a more direct translation, right? But regardless of how you want to translate it, there are the ideas of a title and of a ranking system. So, in the sense that there's a sense of hierarchy that's being established here, by the E character, and then the title basically means, well, you're being denoted for some accomplishment at the very least, right? If not being placed on again in a hierarchy, as we'll see a little bit later. There's been various system of ranking in martial arts and in other traditional practices. Some of them are purely title based, and you just have to know which one comes first and which one comes last, essentially, right? So Here, all we can really figure out is that there is a title that's essentially indicated as a rank, and that is being presented. And that's the second part that's kind of really interesting here. Generally, when you're say you're with the Kendo Federation or with the Judo Federation, I'm sure it's going to be some equivalent. When receiving something, some certificate from them, like say you get a you pass your dan ranking, right? You're not going to get a gift, right? So the characters are going to be used to or like the verbiage that's going to be used to say, oh, on the certificate, oh, this is the rank that you're being awarded, is going to be quite different. Here, basically, okurimasu is essentially kind of, we're presenting to you, we're gifting you. Basically, it's kind of the idea. Gifting is not quite correct here, but it's really like kind of like there's a certain deference, right? Now we're presenting you something, and you're you the awardee is kind of on a pedestal a little bit, right? Or in some cases it can be just some honor, so it can be amongst peers as well. But again, it's the idea that something is being given, not granted, so to speak, right? And I list here a number of other verbs that are going to be, I would argue, more frequently used when we're talking about certification. So that choice of word alone, the choice of verbiage, is actually quite interesting on its own. Now, it seems to indicate that it's being presented by peers or by people that likely have Horikawa Sensei in high esteem. So that was just that little piece there was really interesting, I thought. Then we're moving on to the organization and signatories, so the people who've put their name on the certificate. As I mentioned at the beginning of the section, there's 8 of them. If you're interested to know all their names and their accomplishment, you can go in the article. I've listed a quick pedigree for all of them. I've also provided a breakdown of what categories they fit in. What's interesting here is that the strongest connection, most likely between all the parties involved, is actually political. This is not entirely surprising. Politics and Japanese martial arts, in the 20th century were quite intertwined, especially early on in the 20th century. So for people to have some connection through that's not too surprising. We have also to remember that the schools and there were a lot of training centers and schools where young people at the time would go and essentially they would train in martial arts, right, to build character. And those became kind of early networking centers for people who often end up often becoming quite well established individual within the Japanese society. So those are all reasons why potentially that could explain the connection. My guess, and we'll come back to that a little bit later, is that it may have more to do with the first signatory that's on this document, so Ishida Kazuto, whose name I've already mentioned. We're going to come back to Ishida Sensei in a moment. Suffice to say that his pedigree in martial arts is quite strong. This is someone who was a chief justice, but beyond that was also the soke of Ito Shoden Mutoryu and Hozoin Ryu Takaraha. Now, Ito Shoden Mutoryu is a big deal historically because it goes back to a character named Yamaoka Tesshu, who was one of the last retainer of the Tokugawa Bakufu, and who also ended up becoming a chamberlain to the young Meiji emperor. So somebody who kind of made a very good transition between the old government to the new government. He is considered to have been instrumental in in essentially saving Edo/Tokyo from basically burning to the flames of war by delivering the Tokugawa Bakufu's basically they were giving up. So he was the one to to go and reach out to the other side and make sure that no battles would be fought. That would cause essentially a lot of harm. The other names are also interesting. The other name we're going to come back to at some point is Otsuka Hironori, so the founder of Wadoryu. Wadoryu is a traditional style of karate. It is one that is, basically a amalgam of traditional Okinawan karate and with Japanese jiu-jitsu. Not particularly important for this particular context, but again, we're going to come back and see this name in a short bit. The man on the right here is Ishida Kazuto. Those who are familiar with daito-ryu will also recognize that Okamoto Seigo is on the back on the left. He was present on a number of times when Horikawa, Kodo, and Ishida Kazuto would meet, apparently. They first met, according to what I was able to find, in July 1938 in an article written by Ellis Amder on Guillaume Zerard website, basically describing a little bit where they met and the circumstances of them meeting. There is a picture here that I included that I found in Hiden, the June 2019 release, where apparently Mr. Kusaka, who would have been a direct student of Kusaka Ryunosuke, which would have been the soke of Ito Shoden Mutoryu before. I think there was another one, and then it was Ishida Kazuto Sensei after that. But that's a picture where you can see that Ishida Kazuto is there, and I think it would have been on his right that Mr. Kusaka is present. The note on the picture that I found basically didn't specify, so I'm kind of somewhat guessing here. The relation between Horikawa, Kodo, and Otsuka Hironori, I'm less clear to the level of depth of the relationship they had there. It seems like they met a few times in the 70s and they got along pretty well. But that said, they're basically the only two names in that list of signatories that have really strong Budo background. Now, to contextualize, when you're speaking about, say, people who were part of the police force, chances are they did Kendo, and they were pretty strong at it. So all the people that were police bureaucrats, or that went through police agencies or internal security agencies, those are all people that probably did Kendo. Some of the other political figures most likely also had some martial art background to some degree, but there's no indication that it was beyond just, again, going to doing some practice through school or through some specialized schools in martial arts, some of which existed through the 20s and 30s. So they point being, they never really reached any level where they would have been acknowledged for that, right? So their level of recognition versus the level of recognition that would have been brought and seen by others from, say, somebody like Ishida Kazuto is very different, right? We're talking about somebody who is essentially, Chief Justice on its own right is a big deal, so that gives you a lot of a very strong reputation to begin with. But just being soke of two traditions, I think he also received a menkyo in Onohaitoryu, which, I mean, if you're already the soke of Ito Shoden Mutoryu, I mean, you already have all those documents, so I'm not sure that really counts for anything, but it shows that he had good relationships with headmasters of other traditions, at the very least, right? And to the point where they would at least, show, even if it would have been just a token of respect, to give those kind of documents and to include someone in the tradition, it still means something, right? But overall, that leaves us with, I think, two possibilities as to the nature of the document. One, it was meant as an honorary rank or title within the hierarchy or structure of the Kodokai, or two, it was awarded as for personal accomplishment. It's worth noting that on the certificate itself, it's very hard to see, unfortunately, and I couldn't find a better copy, but you can see that there's two titles here, and in this transcription here, you can see that it's written basically Meiyo Kaicho, which translates to honorary chairman, and then his title of previous Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now here it's not mentioned what organization he's supposed to be the honorary chairman of, right? As we'll discover later, it happens to be the honorary chairman of the Kodokai. So here, when we're looking at those two options, it's kind of possible that we actually end up with something that's maybe in between, right? It is for personal accomplishment and cultural contribution, but it's also something that might have been prepared and crafted by Ishida Kazuto as from his position of honorary chairman of the Kodokai. In which case, then the rank takes a certain meaning, right? It's not, yes, it has the title, has a sense of rank, but it's not necessarily something that's in the specific hierarchy of ranking that the Kodokai uses. Might be something that just kind of sits in between and is really meant to distinguish and memorialize Horikawa Kodo. But we're going to get back to that in the last article of the series. Now, as I mentioned in the earlier in the presentation, basically, Meijin and Eisei Meijin are not titles that I had personally heard of before starting the research on this article, right? So the title itself and its choice, was quite interesting. What I wondered was, why choose those titles, and is there a precedent for choosing those titles? I had some level of familiarity with the history of titles and ranks in martial arts, modern and traditional alike. Now, to kind of get to the bottom of this, I had to learn quite a few more things, and it was very interesting. So here we're just going to summarize a bit what those things are. Now, the first known usage of the term Meijin as a title or a rank is, I believe, was in Go, and very shortly after in Shogi, so Japanese chess. At the time, at the time was essentially associated with the rank of 9th Dan. Then later on, and essentially from 1952 onward, the title came back, and it was basically one that was associated with the Meiji-sen tournament of Shogi. So the way the Shogi circuit works nowadays, basically you have about 7 tournaments, I think, that exist to this day, and each of those tournaments have their own kind of titles and ranks, so to speak. And as we're going to see later, for instance, some of those titles also have the titles that start with Eisei to denote, consecutive victory. Not necessarily consecutive victory, but having won the title more than a certain number of times. The Eisei Meijin certificate nowadays, more pointedly, basically means you've won the tournament of the Meiji-sen tournament 5 times. Now, whether it is kind of the penultimate that can be won through that tournament is not entirely clear to me. If there's anyone that's more familiar with Shogi than I am, by all means. I have asked around to people who are Shogi practitioner, Shogi players, and they weren't able to give me much of an answer. So, but if anyone is knows a little bit more about this, I'd be very happy to hear about it in the comments. And I said 1952, sorry, it was 1949 earlier that the title basically was reintroduced. Interestingly enough, when I was digging into the National Dias Digital Archive, this very interesting place, and that's Sega Saturn, and then later on they had the PlayStation iterations of the game. Basically, that came up, and I had to mention it basically because when looking for Eisei Meijin in the in that database, that's literally like 95% of the results were associated with that game. So chances are, like, people are going to be running into the title of Eisei Meijin, or they're going to run, they're going to look for it. They're going to find that game way more than anything related to Go or well, actually, to shogi, and this is related to shogi. It's a shogi game, but related to martial arts, yeah, there's very few chances of that happening. Now, what is of interest here, and that was the thread that the potential that opened itself basically, is that there is a strong history of using shogi and Go ranking system in modern martial arts. Now, in traditional ones, you didn't really have dan system. The first dan system used would have been in Jigen Ryu. They had, I think, a 4-dan ranking system. But they didn't have any Q ranks like you have in modern martial arts. Often you're going to go through the Qs and then you're going to go to the dans after that, right? Here it's just like you have dans and that's it. Then beyond that, you had levels that were marked as dan as well. So like Shodan, Chudan, Jodan, for instance. So like low, mid, high kind of thing. Tenshin Jinryu has that denomination based depending on the lineage, I believe. I make some mention of this here. I also mention the Yonomaki and Inyonomaki that serve respectively as Menkyo and Kaiden, which are two separate functions as part of that tradition. Then after that, I make mention of some of the titles that I have been able to find something about. Now, interestingly enough, like the Dainippon Butotokukai is the organization that is probably to be credited for some of the titles that exist in Kendo and some of the Kendo Federation's sub-associations today. So when we're talking about Kyoshi, Renshi, Hanshi, for instance, that seems to have started there, although it has older roots than that. But in terms of a federation or association, that's where it seems to have started. Fun fact that I discovered: somebody in one of the Facebook forum that I was asking questions mentioned the title Tashi, and I was wondering what the hell that was until I discovered that it was actually the title of Kyoshi that had been renamed in 1943 to Tashi. Now, which is a particularly unique thing because the Butokukai was disbanded, I think, in 1946. So I'd be really curious to see how many people actually got the Tashi title instead of the Kyoshi one. Just kind of a random thing, but it was really, really, really interesting. Regardless, Meijin wasn't used in that organization. It wasn't used in the Butokukai. It wasn't used, as far as I could tell, with the Teikoku Shobukai, which was a somewhat analogous organization that existed at the time. I couldn't really find the title Meijin being used. I could find the word Meijin, meaning master or somebody of mastery, in Budo literature, but not as a title. You're gonna see here, for instance, you have Kendo books where they say like Kenjutsu Meijin Ho, for instance. So Kenjutsu, it's the master's way of Kenjutsu, I guess could be a translation, right? But that was the extent of what I could find. There was nothing title associated to title. It was just basically kind of colloquial use of the term, it would seem. The closest I could find to a reference to a title was in a research paper by Murayama Terushi, a cultural view of Budo license in Budo and Buddhist esotericism. That diagram comes from apparently an 1885 book of the Metropolitan Police. What makes this really, really ambiguous is that the Metropolitan Police went through a number of iterations, basically, of being reestablished and re-established from 1874 to basically the date that's being mentioned here, 1885. So whether the mention of Meijin here is supposed to be a reference to a title that was from a previous iteration, or whether it was referring to a specific past tradition, classical tradition, it remains unclear to me. So I'm not exactly sure what to do with that. You can see here, similarly, you have this kind of like Gechu Jo kind of sub breakdown by Q, and that's another thing here to be mentioned. They do not have dans, they had Q. They would basically go from NQ to EQ, right? And that was the ranking system that they were using. So again, goes to show that the Dan and Q system didn't come until basically quite later in martial arts, right? It would actually come through judo and Kanno Jikoro, who would basically use shogi and go as foundations for the ranking system that he would establish. That system would quickly be emulated by the Budo Gokui along their title rank. I think starting in 1905, if I recall, they started to use Q, and interestingly enough, they were apparently the first organization to use colored belt for the Q, I believe. I seem to remember seeing something to that effect. Don't take my word on this, but it was. I remember seeing something like that through research. Now, fast forwarding to 1952. 1952 was a big year as far as this article is concerned, because two organizations of concern here were established on the same year. The Kokusai Budoin, or the International Budo Institute, and the Zen Nihon Kendo Renmei, or the Kendo Federation. The Kendo Federation was established in a different format, I think in 1950 or 51, but it was formally established in 1952. And then Jodo and Yaido would be added in 1956 upon their establishment as sub-association. Now, one thing that I wasn't able to dig much further into, and if there's Kendo aficionados here that would be able to fill in some blanks, please leave a note in the comments. But it seems like the Kendo Renmei might have used the Meijin title, but I couldn't find any trace of that. So it is possible that those were confused with Kokusai Budoin titles, which we're going to get into in a moment. But regardless, if that title ever existed, it seemed just like with Go and Shogi it seems to have been associated predominantly with the 9th or 10th Dan, whenever that was established. And the 9th or 10th Dan were functionally abolished in the 70s, and officially abolished in the 2000s when testing for those dances stopped, essentially. So if it is true, and we have reasons to believe based on the parallel to Go and Shogi, if it's true that Meijin would have been associated with those ranks in the similar way that Hanshin Kyoshi generally are not available as titles until you reach a certain Dan ranking, then functionally speaking, that would have ceased to exist as well. So it doesn't. If it ever existed, it doesn't exist anymore in Kendo for sure. Now, that's interesting because Ishida Kazuto was the second chairman of the Kendo Federation, so, whether Meijin was used as a title or not, he would have been familiar with, at the very least, the colloquial use within the culture. And if it were indeed used as a title, he would have been aware of that in that time period for sure. Now, the Kokusai Budoin is a relatively small organization. So, when I was speaking with some people recently on a completely different subject, they seem to have the impression that, the Kokusai Budoin and the current iteration of the Nippon Budo Gokui, so not the one that was disbanded in 1946, but the one that still exists today, that those are huge, big organizations in Japan. Now, I don't know what their current sizes are, but they're not super well known. More pointedly, I think both are organizations where you do not register a tradition or school, but you actually register individually. So, it's just basically kind of more of a martial arts club. And then you get to basically, in the case of the Budo Gokui, you get to go to, you get access to the Budo Den, which is a very place full of history if you want to go train there. In the case of the Kokusai Budoin, I'm not exactly sure what the benefits are. I'm sure there must be some great seminars that are organized and some Kodo Yokai or stuff like that, where people get to exchange. But again, they're not, if for people who might be thinking like, it's on par, if not greater than like the Judo Federation, not at all. It's mostly an independent thing on its own, right? Now, what it was in 1952, I wouldn't be able to really say at this point. Suffice to say that it was established in 1952, and that organization was the only organization that I could find that actually used the term Meijin as part of this title. It's actually one of the few titles other than Dans that they were awarding. I don't recall seeing any Kyoshi, Renshi, Tashi, Hanshi kind of licenses. I think Meijin was the only one that I saw, but I may be wrong. And interestingly enough, you'll remember the name Otsuka Hironori. He was not only a founding member of the organization, along great names like Kyuzo Mifune Kyuzo, Sato Ishizuya, and Nakayama Hakudo, all very famous names. So not only was he a founding member, he also received a Meijin title in 1966. In 1972. In 1966, he received the Order of the Rising Sun, those gold rays with rosettes. That's basically fifth class, I think. It's the same one that was also awarded to Horikawa Kodo later. Now, here we can see the actual certificate that was awarded to him. The specific title was First Generation Karate-do Meijin 10th Dan rank. So that's a mouthful. In Japanese, that's going to be, and bear with me, Karate-do Shodai Meijin I Judan. Also quite a mouthful in Japanese. Other people who were awarded this title, I believe, Shibaki Shomaru was awarded the title. I know that Shiragozo was awarded the title. By the time he was awarded the title, though, it had changed a little bit of form. They didn't have like the Shodai Meijin, or like they didn't have like the generational marker, basically. But he would definitely have been familiar with that title, right? And so maybe he was the one to suggest some title like that. I'm not sure. Now here also actually something that I just noticed now, which is of interest. So you remember that I was mentioning the okurimasu, the verbiage in the certificate for Horikawa Kodo's certificate. Now if you notice here, right next to the characters for Meijin, right under the chrysanthemum logo, you're gonna see that it says Okuri-ish. So it's basically uses the same character here. So again, that's an indication of the nature of the title, right? It is a title that's given in deference, basically. It's presented, it's not granted, right? So again, an indication that if we were to draw parallels, it's not like some certification title for sure. But that's pretty much it, and most importantly, none of these organizations use the title of Eisei Meijin. The only one that uses it still to this day would be the Eisei, the Meiji-sen Shogi tournament. So we can draw some parallel to Meijin. Maybe we can kind of fill in the gaps to say, well, it's inspired by the Shogi one, and it has that perenniety nature, if you will, of saying that, well, you're not only well established, but you will be remembered for it. We're gonna see more of that in the next article in the series. Now, where we're at this point is we've done a breakdown of the certificate. We've looked into the history of Meijin as a title, Eisei Meijin as a title. We don't actually have a whole lot to go on in terms of trying to draw parallel to prior usage. So we're sort of down to looking at just the linguistics of it. So, what are the definition of Meijin? What is the etymology of the term? How it's been used in the past? How it's used today? I'm going to go relatively quickly through that. This is the kind of thing you'll want to take the time to sit down and just read for yourself. It's pretty heavy. But the highlights are pretty straightforward. Eisei could have been translated in a number of ways. I have chosen to use eternal just because my intuition really told me that the certificate was honorific in nature. So early on I figured Eisei might actually be translated into not permanent but really eternal here. Now I mentioned this here because arguably given it's a early choice, you could have included and induced some bias in my thinking. So readers and viewers beware. The definition of Meijin, I've basically pulled two from two different places, one from Wikipedia, one from Kodo, which is a relatively well-known Japanese dictionary, dictionary in Japanese for Japanese people, basically. The first one, though, is kind of really to the point, right? An individual excelling in one art and renowned for it. Na no aru hito no koto. So, na no aru is like, the way I would essentially interpret this is kind of, well, you've made a name for yourself through your practice, right? So you've gained renown and reputation through your practice. Now, in and of itself, I don't really see... I mean, the etymology of the term really point to that direction anyway. So, Meiyo, for instance, like we've seen prior, again, honor, prestige, reputation, honorific, namae, again, name, jin is just for marker for person. So really, again, it's kind of like, you've made a name for yourself, essentially, I think would be a simple, rough interpretation of the term, right? So while Japanese to English dictionaries are going to often translate this to master, I think it's worth to kind of contextualize the meaning of that term, right? Master is not an incorrect translation. It's just that you need to contextualize it in the understanding you have of it in that particular context, right? For that particular translation. Some synonyms are going to be I included hakase here, but it's hakase is really not a synonym. The only real synonym here in that list would be probably Tatsujin. And as we can see in this graphic below, this is something I discovered when I was Googling. It was like kind of top page. It was really interesting because apparently there's enough people asking that question that people are doing infographics for it. So even for Japanese people, the difference between Tatsujin and Meijin is not necessarily particularly clear. So there's that. But the idea here is still of relevance for the purpose of the discussion. Tatsujin is, well, if you work hard enough, you're going to become good at it. Meijin is, well, you have gained a level of superiority and you're now above your peers, so to speak, right? So here they refer to like kyoso ni katsu koto ga hitsuyou. So basically, you've won a competition and you need to win a competition to be declared Meijin. Now, this isn't, I think, exactly true, but again, I think you get the point, right? You need to have been declared above your peers, basically, and using the title of Meijin is kind of a way to declare someone above your peers. With that said, and again, keeping in mind that there's not much distinction between the two terms in colloquial Japanese, I think for most people they would use either in the same way, basically, right? And wouldn't necessarily make that point of distinction here. Now, with that said, it's still interesting, I think, to have a look at kind of, what word was used the most historically and in what period and so on and so forth. This is where, I initially wanted to remove hakase from the dataset, but, one of those things you learn along the way, right? Hakase was used a long time ago. We're talking about like 794. And apparently that's because of the, not education system, but basically the administrative system of governance, where they had the title for, specialists in various literary and scientific fields. and that's where the title of like a hakase for PhD or basically a doctor, that's where it comes from in Japanese. So that was very interesting. But it also shows that that's a title. That's what a title with a long history and a frequent usage. That's how it looks like, right? It's not like if you had that many more Hakase and Meijin or Tatsujin people. I think it goes to show that it was a title was more frequently used. It must have been at least in a certain class of well-read people, it might have been better known. Now, removing that term, we can see that basically Meijin is used more frequently in more recent years, so from the Meiji era, but prior to that it was basically not really used, and Tatsujin has a slightly longer history. By the way, this data comes from the National Institute for Japanese Language and Linguistics. So if you're interested in recreating those graphs, it's very simple. You can go to that website, punch in the word you're looking for, download the Excel file for each of those words, just crunch them into a single one, and use Google Sheets to create a graph with that. That's essentially what I did here. Now, that was interesting, but I wanted to see more, right? And unfortunately, that was the limited extent of what the Linguistic Institute was offering. So, being the crafty programmer that I am, I figured, hey, what can I do to generate more interesting data and visualization? The results, albeit not very well, I could have done better, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. I've still nonetheless elected to share it with everyone publicly, so you can go to gitlab.com/budo.social/jungle, I believe is the URL, or you can go on the page and just click the link, and you will be able to access the scripts that I've used to generate those beautiful graphs that you have here. Now, I'm not going to go and describe what's on each one of those. I think I will stop just to show this last one here, right here. So those two last one, basically, you can see basically that the term Meijin and Tatsujin, both of them, were far more used in stuff like baseball and shogi. So two very different practices, arguably, but then followed by some martial arts. So it's according to, I think that's the Wikipedia data set. The data set from Japan Search was giving a slightly different story, but albeit not that different. Tatsujin and Meijin are basically, not strongly, they're not uniquely correlated with martial arts. They are somewhat strongly correlated with martial arts, but there are other practices that uses the term far more frequently. Now, this is just interesting because it gives us some vague sense of whether it is a term that is particular or particularly used by a given sphere of activity, and I think that's what I was trying. No, that's what I was trying to get to. But in terms of semantics, I mean, it does carry the meaning of being the best in your field, right? So even if it would be something that's honorific in nature, it's still kind of a proclamation. If you put this in the title, the idea is, well, you're still above the rest of us, right? So I think that's really the important thing here. Now, it's worth mentioning that as a word in a term, it has been used in other contexts. Sagawa Yukiyoshi apparently had this. This is a Hiden article from 2007, where he was referred to as the Saigo no Meijin, basically, which kind of gives you the impression that Meijin was kind of a thing in daito-ryu, which it wasn't beyond the Kodokai and the Horikawa Kodo. Whether he decided to use that term because it was inspired of that, or whether the writer decided to use that term because of that, I'm not exactly sure, or maybe it's just a coincidence. I haven't really looked into it. But it was interesting to see that the word Meijin as a more colloquial term was being used here, and so that gives us a contrast to say, well, while it may not have been like a certification thing, the title is still more than just a colloquial use, right? In the next session, we're going to actually look at, just getting all that information together and see how it contrasts with other testimonies and records of what that title was. So now we've looked at the certificate itself, we look at the historical context and background, and we've looked at linguistics. We're kind of left with, well, how are people talking about the certificate, and what kind of, and before that, what kind of interpretation can we come up to contrast those interpretations. I go through basically just a summary of what we've gone through at that point in time, and keeping in mind we still have one article to go that's going to shed a lot of light on what this whole thing actually was. But at this point in time, my interpretation was, well, they were trying to celebrate Horikawa Kodo's Budo accomplishments. So not, of course, being a daito-ryu, recognized as a daito-ryu headmaster of his lineage, obviously it's associated to the daito-ryu, but the point I was trying to make here is that I don't think it was associated, or it didn't appear to be associated with any particular aspect of his practice. Given the fact that you have a whole bunch of people that put their name on this document that were far more, renowned because of their politics and, not because of any connection to martial arts, it kind of told me that, we were talking about something that was perhaps more about Budo culture in terms of recognition more than skills or proficiency specifically, right? So, still a big deal. I mean, you have to get 8 people to put their name on the document to honor you. It's still no small feat, right? Now, the question, there's 2 questions that I still had kind of pending, and interestingly enough, I was able to find quickly documents that didn't provide definitive answers, but I think are still pretty indicative. So, was it a title or an award? Well, here's a document awarded to a man called Okubo. And you will see that on the bottom document that's being seen here, you have Eisei Meijin I Horikawa Kodo, then the name of Okamoto Seigo, so of the Roppokai, and then Mr. Okubo's name, right? So here we have Okamoto Seigo referring to Horikawa Kodo as Eisei Meijin I, right? Instead of using Shihan or Honbucho or any other title. No, Honbucho arguably would not have made a whole bunch of sense here, but that choice of title was pretty interesting because this isn't a title that is pervasive in daito-ryu. So it's basically, using a title that was given by some external entity into a document that's seemingly internal to the tradition. I don't remember if there were any notes as to what this particular document was, but given it's on a scroll, we can assume it was probably a transmission document. So if that's the case, that is a daito-ryu document. So, that choice is pretty telling. It tells us, well, yeah, it was kind of a title, if not a rank. And, it was considered as such by somebody like, Mr. Okamoto. So, direct student of Horikawa Kodo, who was present numerous times when Ishida Kasuto, one of the signatory, was present as well, right, when they were both meeting. So to me, it kind of gives you the idea that it is treated as a title, even if it wasn't awarded as such. Today it's treated as a title. Now, to the question of, is it a daito-ryu or kodokai title, or is it some random title? I found this document from the Kitami Budo Tsushin, so basically a kind of news leaflet, I think, that was written by the Kitami City Kobudo Shinkokai, so basically a Budo preservation organization for the city of Kitami. And here they refer to the title in full form as Daito-ryu Aiki Jujutsu Eisei Meijin I. So, the prefix of daito-ryu Aiki Jujutsu here is kind of interesting. What is also very interesting is that if it is published by a preservation organization, we can presume that the Kodokai is part of it and that they would have received that document and may have requested corrections to it. This isn't a physical copy that I got. It's a digital copy that's still available online. I think I put the link in the closed caption at the bottom, so right here. And that's from 2015, so there would have been plenty of time to issue a correction. So that they haven't issued a correction, I think, is telling. Maybe they didn't care. I mean, these are not the kind of documents that I think, you're gonna mull over for all that long. But I thought it was indicative. I mean, whether that's, to what degree, I think is to be, taken with a grain of salt, though. But it may have been, again, that's just a quick indication that it may have been, a Kodo related title in some way, shape, or form. Now, there's a few public statements. I'm not going to go over all of them here. The point I was trying to get to here is, more in the last three statements that essentially are either poor translations or misinterpretations or, kind of deformation of truth. I don't know why. Often when these kind of things are happening, it kind of feels like you're blowing the person you're speaking, like you're blowing the character of the person you're speaking about a bit out of proportion for some purpose or goal. It just seemed a little bit strange to me that people from Kodokai offshoots didn't actually elect to be as accurate as the Kodokai is. Now the Kodokai is pretty secretive, or at least they don't really speak a lot publicly. Arguably, they've published quite a few things in Hiden in the last few years. A lot of the material I found was basically from articles they were involved with. But yeah, a lot of the stuff that's been written, both in Japanese and in English, is it's filled with inaccuracies and with very strange formulation that seems to overinflate the significance of the certificate and the title that was being given here. And I think that's a bit problematic. I would suggest that the individuals in charge of maintaining those sites or writing those statements might actually want to look at the series as a whole, make up their own opinion, maybe talk to other people they know, and try to provide a better phrasing for discussing this title than what is currently available in their publications. Otherwise, it's just kind of, it's very strange looking. I think you don't even need to do that much research to really realize that, well, the highest title of the Budo Society doesn't really mean much. And what Budo Society? Budo Society is not a thing. We're talking about a single organization. We're talking about Budo as a whole. Who decided it was the highest title? Is it culturally driven? Is there a history to that? Well, no, none of that we've seen. Yeah, that's a bit problematic, right? It's not the point of the article here, but I think it was still something worth mentioning, and especially in the context of what's coming up next. Now, this last article here is basically something that I wrote. I think the first 4 articles took me about a month to write. This one alone took me about a month and a half to complete. The reason for this, as you'll see, are basically because of the lack of familiarity that I had with certain things, but also just because, it took a lot of time. Now, there is a ongoing series. I've only published one article in that series yet about the Daitokan newsletters, or in Japanese, daito-ryu Budo Kaiho. That particular series. So there's been a few different series that were issued by the Daitokan or by later on the Seishinkai and the Shinbukan in parallel, when both organizations were fighting for the legacy of mainline. But that's a particular publication. It ran between 1971 and 1992. And I happen to have the physical copies at home, and those are my personal copies. I had them planned to digitize them for a long time. I every once in a while kind of go to them to take pictures and currently share them on Instagram, but sometimes just to kind of keep in my digital archive, but I hadn't really digitized the entire documents. Now it's one of those. It's in one of those fishing expedition for basically finding some pictures for Instagram that I randomly found out this beautiful article. The title being the Eisei Meijin ni kagayaku Horikawa Kodo sensei. So Horikawa Kodo sensei celebrated with the Eisei Meijin title. And I figured I would essentially just do a transcription and translation of the document and leave it there for everyone to see. I'm not going to go and do a reading of that. I suggest you actually do a reading of the article after completing viewing this video or after reading the rest of the series on your own, and just come up with your own conclusion, right? Try to, and if you want to leave a comment about this in the comment below, by all means, right? How accurate was the process that we went through in regards to getting us ballpark close to the truth, right? What's interesting here is that this is probably the only written account that I could find about the awarding and the apparent meaning of the certificate and the title, right? Now, just to basically give some context, there was a event on September 15, 1974 to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the founding of the Daito-ryu Aikijutsu Kodokai. Now, actually, that's a typo. It should have been the 25th anniversary. So that was basically a mistake, and it wasn't caught by the editorial process. But it was also, perhaps most importantly, celebrating Horikawa Kodo's 80th anniversary. So there was basically those two occasions. There was a Kodokai Embu. There was a demonstration by a Kodokai member. Horikawa sensei himself also performed some of his mysterious and occult techniques. That's the best translation I could come up with. It's basically kind of like his dark arts kind of thing, the way it's written in Japanese. And then here we also get a clarification as to, in comparison to what's on the certificate. Meiyo Kaicho Kodokai Ishida Kazuto. All the other titles that we can see here on the left in yellow, they're all the same. But in this article, they actually make specifically clear that Ishida Kazuto was the chairman of the Kodokai, and not just the organization not being left ambiguous here, right? Now remember that date here, September 15, 1974. We're gonna get back to this in a moment. Now, the rest of the article is basically highlighting various life events related to Horikawa Kodo and Daito-ryu. We can see here in a picture that Horikawa Kodo, on his left, you can see Tokimune Sensei, so we can confirm that he was at the event. We can also see at the top on the banner that it says clearly it's the 25th anniversary, not the 30th. So that's a mistake in the article. But it goes to show that Tokimune Sensei was there, he was present, and he most likely wrote the article we see above. It has to be said that it's not actually specifically mentioned who wrote the article, but the vast majority of the content in the Daito-ryu Aikibudo Kaiho was written by Tokimune Sensei. So it would be very surprising if it wasn't him in this particular case. Now, one last thing through, again, because that article series wouldn't let me go. But as I was looking for pictures, and more specifically, the picture that we see of the certificate that we've discussed, I also ran into this calligraphy awarded by Ishida Kazuto, and only him, to Horikawa Kodo. The reason why it was interesting. In terms of content, I will leave you to read the content. It's really kind of deep cut. Now, I asked, I think, probably 24 people what this text might be. Nobody knew. And I had to basically figure it out for my own. Now, interestingly enough, and just to show, this text is not unique. In this calligraphy is not unique. I have an example here that's from 1935, written by a Kendoka. I've linked to his profile on Wikipedia, I think in Japanese. Now, this text is also found in a a text called the Budo Zenshu, also known as the Budo Gokui. Now, the Budo Gokui is a little bit of a confusing name because there are two books, one from 1925, one from 1935 that bear the same name. The 1925 one was written by Kodo Press, so Black Dragon Society related, perhaps. I'm not exactly sure. This one is from 1930. Sorry, I said 1935, but it's 1934. Now, the text, I believe, is not available online, but the book can be purchased online. And the highlighted segment and hold on a second. What am I saying? No, sorry. The text is actually available online, so you can go and see it online. It's at the National Diet Digital Archive. The text below, though, was not. It comes from Ishida Kazuto's memoirs. And you can see, actually, the quote is the text that's present here at the top in this calligraphy and in this one is partially referred to in two different places in this book. One towards the beginning, I think talking about his life living in Kamakura, where he was, where his residence was, I believe. And then there's the second part here, speaking more directly about martial arts. I have provided a partial translation of this because, quite honestly, this text, what it means, I have no idea. What I can say is, according to what I was able to find, it eventually kind of made the jump from the world of Kendo to the world of Aikido. I have other publications that I've been able to source where Ueshiba Kishimaru makes reference to that quote, for instance. There's a few websites nowadays that somehow make references to this text. And I think it's Kishimaru Sensei obviously refers to it as, like, in his. There's a chapter in one of his book that's Kino Nagare, and it's basically like, quoting this text. But that's all pretty vague. What it actually is supposed to mean, I am not sure. The other thing I wasn't able to confirm with certainty is the actual portion of the original text it comes from. So, it comes from a military strategy treaty called Tora no Maki. That's reportedly written somewhere in the 1100s. The link that I include here is a handwritten copy that was written in 1733. Now, this is all in cursive, and if you can find where the quote is in this book, I'll buy you a coffee or a beer or whatever it is that you drink, because I tried to look at this text and I couldn't make heads or tails of most of it. So not too surprising, but I was kind of hoping to be able to find the specific location. I just wasn't able to. And here's the text, basically. So it's from Aikido Giho, that was written by Kishimaru Sensei, but with editorial supervision of Ueshiba Morihei Sensei. So there you have it. Now, that's not particularly interesting. The only reason why I mention it is because I think the subtitle to the picture of that certificate here was stating something like, as you have here, basically. It's a congratulatory address to Horikawa Oru. So basically, that's Oru is an honorific for elder man, basically, that you have great respect for. So the point I was trying to make here is that, while I'm not sure, it might have been more celebratory than congratulatory. There's a bit of a fine line here, but the text itself is not a congratulation note, if you will. That's kind of what I wanted to point on, and showing that it's not a text that's unique either. What is interesting, though, is the title by which Horikawa Kodo is referred, and the date. Now, the date itself is also something that took me about 2 days. There's one person German friend of mine that basically just figured it out for me in like 10 minutes because he's smart. So thank you. But the text here is basically the date. It's a very, very archaic way of writing a date, so I've broken it down here. So Showa era, Wood Tiger, autumn, September. That translate, don't ask. You can go and make the count. I've included a link here. When you click on Wood Tiger, you can go and see how the Japanese sexagenary cycles are used to be working, and good luck with understanding how to do the math for that. What is relevant is that this computes to September of 1974 with no day of the month included. The title attached is Aikido Daito-ryu Meijin. So this is an example of the title of Meijin, or at least, colloquial title, something in between a colloquial use and an actual title that we can see here, used specifically by Ishida Kazuto sensei. So, this gives a lot of credence to the idea that, because the date was very close to the same date of the certificate that we've studied here, and the title of Meijin here is being included instead of Eisei Meijin, it's just pure Meijin. It kind of gives credence to the idea that perhaps Ishida Kazuto was the person who has come up with the title for the certificate that we've studied today. So all in all, going back to the top article here, I've added at the end of the series here a whole bunch of essentially kind of misconception. But to summarize, what we found is interesting. I think it paints a very interesting picture, not only of Horikawa Kodo, but also of his relationship with Ishida Kazuto. It shows an individual who basically was, they probably were quite close. And at the very least, they had a very strong mutual respect, I think. Now, this being said, to go and say that, this was a title that was like, for the bestest Budoka of all, doesn't really make sense. It doesn't align with anything. It doesn't remove anything from the greatness of Horikawa Kodo. Thanks to him, by and large, Daito-ryu was popularized in Japan and outside of it. So, that again, I think it's a matter of, we're not trying to belittle anyone here. We're trying to contextualize their achievement. And I would argue here that this contextualization kind of shows a much better picture of Horikawa Kodo, someone who, and throughout our study we've seen that he was involved not just in Daito-ryu but also in Kendo. He had a good Kenjutsu background. He was first noticed for that for that practice, and he was also renowned as an educator, as a person that was teaching to young people, and school director for early level education. That's a man to be celebrated, I think. And to go and say, well, no, it has to be only about one aspect of the practice, I think is kind of reductive in a way that really isn't serving the memory of the man. And that's what I was getting at when it comes down to that particular article specifically. But also I wanted to point out, by keeping the entire content that I came up with intact essentially, and just releasing it all out, I wanted to show that the journey is the reward. We've learned a lot about just Japanese history and martial arts history and Chinese classical text and how to read ancient dates and that kind of stuff. Those are all things I had to learn to some degree to be able to really properly frame the information I was presented and understand it, and ultimately write an article. And to basically take that away, I think, from the set of article would have essentially kind of removed a bit of, it would have made the content less accessible, I fear, when this is the kind of things I'm writing for, hopefully a broader audience of people interested in history, in daito-ryu, in martial arts, or some combination of the three. So that's it for today, and that was a very long series. It's going to be a very long video. I might actually break it down into multiple parts. Again, if you have any questions, comments as to this format of doing article readings, please leave them in the comment section below. As always, thank you for your time, and until next time.